Political attitudes play a very important role in our lives. They influence the choices that we make during elections, the policies that we support, and the candidates that we vote for. It is therefore important for us to study how we develop political attitudes. In particular, it is important to establish the credibility, legitimacy, and integrity of the information that is exposed to us as we develop political attitudes and make political choices. In this special episode of the book series, I called a professor of psychology at Wheaton College here in Massachusetts. Her new book, Blame and Political Attitudes: The Psychology of America's Culture War, was published by Palgrave Macmillan, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that is in the description panel of this video. Enjoy the show. Professor Gail Sahar, I'm happy to have you today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
That's wonderful. I should have come to Wheaton College to do this in person, but I guess with the convenience that technology gave us, we can just get to enjoy the discussion right here on Zoom. So to get us started, I want you to just briefly introduce yourself. Tell our audience who you are, where you are currently working, the work that you have been doing in terms of research and publications, the classes that you have been teaching, so that our international audience can get to understand you and your background.
Of course. So I actually am originally from the West Coast of the United States. I got my PhD from UCLA, and I came to Wheaton College, which is a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. And by small, I mean only about 1,800 students. And I have stayed there for 30 years. I really enjoyed teaching undergraduates. It's a purely undergraduate institution with small courses and lots of attention to the students. I teach a number of courses there. I've taught many over the years. So social psychology is one of my specialties, as well as I teach a seminar in political psychology, which is probably the closest to this book. In fact, I use the book in this class. I've also taught quantitative research methods, statistics, a lab in social psychology. So I'm really a very research-focused psychologist, not a clinical psychologist. In terms of research, my passion all along, since I was quite young, it started in graduate school and even before, has been trying to understand people's attitudes toward controversial social issues. So I was always fascinated by why people can have completely different views on the same issue, right? Even very smart people can see an issue very, very differently. And so that has sort of been my life's work, is to try to understand what it is that's driving these attitudes, whether it's toward, poverty or abortion or gay rights or whatever it might be. I'm really interested in these kind of hot button issues.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you so much. So it's very strategic that I'm talking to you right immediately after this presidential election that turned out to be, a discussion that generated so much debate in different groups of people across different parts of the country, in different states. I was following very closely social media debates. I was even having some extended conversations with people here at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and friends from outside. Mm-hmm. So I want you to start by just telling us what you consider to be the core ideas of your book and its central argument.
Okay. So the book is called Blame and Political Attitudes. So it's about the way we place blame for social problems, largely. But it comes from a theory that's not really political at all. It comes from a theory called attribution theory. which is a theory of how individuals attribute causes for events that happen to themselves and other people. And the idea of the theory is that people want to understand the social world. So whatever happens to us, we go around asking why. Why did that happen? Why did I not do well on that test? Or why did my friend not say hello to me in the street? Or whatever it might be, that we do this all the time. And the way we answer the why question has a big impact on our feelings and our behaviors in the future. And that's kind of what the theory is in a nutshell. So for an example that I think is kind of intuitive, imagine that a student fails to show up for an exam in my class, right? And I notice the student isn't there, and probably one of the first things I'll think is, why are they not here? Right? And I could come up with many reasons why they might not be there. So perhaps they got in a car accident on their way to school, or perhaps they're in the emergency room, or perhaps they just overslept, or they didn't feel like taking the test, right? So there are many different explanations that I could come up with. And according to the theory, the way I answer that question will influence then how I feel about that student and how I behave toward them. So if I find out that the student, in fact, was in the emergency room and had some kind of a health crisis, I'll probably be very sympathetic. I'll probably let them take the exam later. If, on the other hand, I find out they just didn't feel like taking it and they went to the beach or something, then in that case, right, I would tend to say, well, I'm sorry, that's your responsibility, and you'll have to take an F on the exam. So the theory goes, we come to a cause, and depending on whether we see the cause as under the personal control of the individual, we either feel sympathy or anger, and we then behave in ways that are consistent with that. If I feel sympathy, I want to help them. If I feel anger, I don't want to help, but I may even want to punish them. So that's the basic theory. And this was not developed by me. It was many psychologists over the years, particularly Bernard Weiner, who was my graduate advisor. So my contribution to the field has been to apply that theory toward political attitudes. So I was interested in, to what degree do our attitudes toward particular issues stem from our beliefs about the causes of those issues, the causes of the problem. So does my belief about what causes poverty influence my attitudes toward helping the poor? That's the sort of thing. And in my research, I find that it very much does. It very much fits in with the everyday example. So we're not so different politically than we are even in our normal social worlds. So that's the sort of basic argument. There's much more to it, of course, but that is the kind of fundamental idea of the book.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. So I like that you mentioned that the theory, you are not the one who propounded the theory yourself, but it's been there, and different groups of scholars have addressed the theory in different ways. What do you think is the major contribution of your book generally to this discourse of political psychology, or however you might want to define the different discourses that the book contributes to?
Yes, excellent. So it is, I think it's the only book I know of that really is applying this theory to politics. And I think it's very important because I think political discourse right now is very, very focused on what they call the culture war. This idea that all of our attitudes are determined purely by our ideology. If I'm a liberal, I believe, right, I am pro-welfare, I'm pro-choice, I'm pro-gay rights, et cetera. If I'm a conservative, I'm against those things. And that's the kind of simplistic argument that I think we see very much in the media, that we can perfectly predict people's attitudes by knowing their ideology, and that America is completely divided and polarized because of these ideologies. And my research suggests something quite different, that in fact, there's much more overlap in the way liberals and conservatives think about attitudes, issues, and political policies. So rather than just thinking about, are they liberal or conservative, I'm interested in thinking about, well, what do they see as the cause of the problem? And how does that relate to their end attitude? And what I've discovered is that political ideology does influence the way we place blame. So probably this is intuitively understandable to your audience, that if we're liberal, we are more likely to blame the system. So if I see someone poor, I'm more likely to say, the system isn't providing enough jobs, or there's discrimination, or that sort of thing. Jobs are going overseas. If I'm conservative, I'm more likely to say it's the person's individual responsibility. They're not trying hard enough, et cetera. So that holds up very well in these studies. And then what happens as a result of that is, as I described before, if we see it as uncontrollable, as a part of the system, in other words, we tend to feel sympathy, we support helping them. If we tend to see it as the individual's responsibility, instead we tend to feel very little sympathy, maybe even anger, and we don't want to help them. So what my book proposes is to fill in the kind of blank between ideology and attitude. And what I am suggesting is that in between ideology and attitude are these judgments about what is the cause of the social problem? Whose fault is it? Who do I blame? And therefore, that is what ultimately influences attitudes. And I think that's really important because ideology is extremely hard to change. I can't make a liberal into a conservative or vice versa, but there is evidence that people can talk about what are the causes of the problem, and that people can find sometimes common understanding in that way. And that there are even studies now, some very recent interesting studies, that show that you can change people's beliefs about the causes of social problems by providing them information. So, for example, you can provide information about how someone became poor, and it actually begins to have the individual blame them less. They begin to see that, well, there were societal factors that influenced this person. It wasn't only that they were lazy or whatever. So that's the sort of general idea, and why I think it's so important that I really would like us to back away from this culture war idea and to give people a little more credit for actually thinking about political issues.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. I think that's an excellent response. These are issues that people always talk about. Why are certain people rich? Why are certain people poor? Why are other countries rich? Why are other countries poor? And it all goes down to how we think, how we conceptualize things, our attitudes, and our approach towards solving those issues. One issue that I've always had, in many of these discussions, is trying to balance between ideology, history, and the attitudes that we develop as we are faced with a political situation. Like you said, that it's hard to convince a liberal to be a conservative, just like that, or to convince a conservative to be a liberal, just like that.
Right.
So sometimes I feel like maybe opening the pages of history, it can help us to understand that, okay, let us take a pause and ask ourselves, why are we where we are today as a group? And then we can better understand it. So I think that, this is a very interesting way to approach it. And I think we can now get very well into the discussion of the major findings of the book. So what did you find in your research, and what do we learn from it?
Great. Well, one of the main things that I emphasize in the book is that although we think about political issues, right, we're faced with an issue and we process information about it, perhaps what caused the problem, et cetera, we are not without bias in how we make those decisions. So one of my big focuses is understanding the individual bias we bring into that judgment, right? So one of these is created by ideology, as I mentioned, that there is a general tendency, it's a part of conservatism to see the individual as responsible. And any conservative will tell you this. It's not meant as a critique, it just is a fact. But also there are other things that influence us. One is culture. So one of the reasons that I focus so much on blame is that the United States in particular is a very blaming culture. I think it's due to our history. You mentioned history, and I think it is really important to think of the history of a country. Our history comes from the idea of individualism, of every person, bringing themselves up by their own bootstraps, as they say, right? And that everybody is responsible for themselves. We're a very individualistic culture. The result of that can be that if anyone fails, we see them as responsible, right? And what's been interesting to me is to look at other cultures that don't necessarily see that. So more collectivist cultures, which see themselves as people are more intertwined. They see people as in a kind of web of social relationships. And they really have a more complex idea of causation for that reason. So they're not only looking at, oh, what did you do, but about the broader social situation or societal situation. And this characterizes many non-Western countries. I mean, Asia is usually the example they most frequently give, but I think it characterizes many other countries as well. So I was very interested in that, the fact that Americans are particularly likely to focus on blaming the individual. There are also a couple of other factors that lead us to do that. One is something called the fundamental attribution error. And this is a general tendency, not only in politics, but in other areas too, that when we see someone do something, we're very quick to assume it's about them. It's their personality, their disposition, etc. We rarely think about the situational factors. So if I see someone trip and fall on the sidewalk, I usually don't think what's wrong with the sidewalk. I usually think, oh, that person is clumsy, right? So that's a very trivial example, but we do that in all kinds of ways, even around political issues. And there's also some evidence that people like to come to causes that protect their view that the world is just. So if I, for example, were to say there are people in this country who are poor through no fault of their own, then I have to face the idea that the system may not be fair. And that is very uncomfortable for people. So my theory is that part of the reason we so quickly blame the individual is to protect our belief that our society is fair. So we don't have to face this possibility that bad things could happen to good people, that bad things could happen to us, right, through no fault of our own. So those are some of the kind of early elements that I go into in the book, looking at, ideology, culture, and then these biases. And the rest of the book is really going through specific issues. So I already talked a bit about poverty. I have one chapter entirely about how we attribute the causes of poverty. Not only poverty, but also the state of the economy. So this is very relevant to presidential elections. You may probably have heard that there are many of the reasons that people think that Trump won has to do with dissatisfaction with the current economy. And there's a lot of evidence that people will tend to blame the incumbent, right, for the state of the economy, and that can really come back to bite them. And I think it really did in the case of Harris, even though she's not the incumbent, she is certainly Biden's vice president. And so I think there was a lot of blaming of her for the state of the economy and thinking, I don't like this inflation, you're right, my salary isn't increasing. And so there's sort of blaming the party and therefore voting for the opposite party. So that's one of the ways it operates. I also look at issues of sexuality, as I mentioned. So there's a lot of evidence, for example, that the way people attribute the causes of homosexuality are linked with their attitudes toward equality for gay and lesbians. So people who believe, for example, in legalized same-sex marriage tend to attribute being gay to something uncontrollable and internal to the person. It's who they are. Whereas people who are against those things are more likely to say they're choosing this, and therefore, they choose it. And for people who believe it's wrong, there are some people who believe it's wrong, then they will tend to say, well, then they should not have these rights because they're doing something that I think is wrong and it's under their control. So that's sort of the idea there. I also talk a bit about things like sexual assault. As you've been living in the United States, you're probably aware of the Me Too movement that is all about women bringing forth charges of being either sexually assaulted or sexually harassed by powerful men. And many men have sort of fallen as a result of this. And what I was really interested in is how people place blame for those situations. And there's evidence that many people do not see the woman as responsible in these cases, but many people, in fact, do blame the woman and say, well, she must have done something wrong. She shouldn't have gone to the hotel room, or what was she wearing? There's all of these factors that they're looking for reasons to hold the woman responsible. And I believe part of it is because of this fear of acknowledging that sexual assault can happen through no fault of one's own, right? So those things are rather US focused, although not exclusively US focused. I'm also very interested in international relations and how these kinds of attitudes could translate when we're looking at, conflicts with other countries, for example. And there's a lot of evidence that when we're in conflict with another country, we tend to see all the bad things they do as their choice, about them, intentional. When we do bad things, we tend to say we had to. We had no choice. They forced us to do it, right? And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing. When we do good things, we take credit. When they do good things, we say, well, they had to do that, right? They had international pressure or whatever. So I believe it even informs the way we think about international issues. And I myself, a number of years ago, did a study of terrorism, beliefs about the causes of terrorism. It was right after the 9/11 attacks. And I was interested in how people attributed responsibility and what they thought motivated the terrorists. What was the cause of the 9/11 attack? And we found that, again, it's a sort of mix. Some people saw it as, well, it's fundamentalist or mentally ill extremists who carried it out because they hate the US, right? And other people said it might have something to do with American military actions in the Middle East, right? So again, there are things that blame more the situation and things that blame more the individual. And the way people make those decisions really influences the way they think about, should we go to war and what should be done, and levels of anger and all those sorts of things. So I think what's been fascinating to me is how well this theory translates to so many different issues. The final chapter is actually, well, the second to the final chapter is actually about Donald Trump. So again, very topical at the moment. And what I was interested in there was the way Trump used blame in his campaigns. And I think it's true both the 2016 and the current campaign. In 2020 as well, for that matter. He is very strategic in the way he places blame. So, for example, Americans are upset about the economy, they're upset about crime, et cetera. And he finds groups of people to blame that kind of rally Americans around him. So he'll say, well, the problem is people who are undocumented immigrants, right? They're causing terrorism, or they're causing crime, or they're responsible for the downturn of the economy. The other strategic way he places blame often is on the political establishment. So this was especially the case when he was running against Hillary Clinton. He took a very populist kind of position, which is, the problem is that politicians don't care about you. They don't care about the everyday person. And that populism is very much based on how we place blame, right? Blaming political elites rather than blaming other factors. So I do a kind of in-depth analysis about the way he talks about blame, why it sells so well with his followers. It's obviously he has a very strong following. And I think people love him, and well, there are many reasons they love him, but part of the reason I think is that he's very good at placing blame in a way that resonates with a lot of American people. It takes Americans out of the spotlight. It's not our fault, it's the fault of other people, right? And I think that can be very appealing, especially for people who feel that they really don't have a voice in society. So I think that is very something he's done very successfully. And the last chapter, I really try to get a little more hopeful, which is thinking about how we can actually use this theory to improve what we call the culture wars. So how can we bring people together more? And as I touched on a bit earlier, one of the ways of doing that is really to expose people to information that influences how they see the causes of social problems. One element that I do talk about that I actually left out was also about racial inequality in the United States, very controversial issue. And there's evidence that a lot of people attribute racial inequality, and by this I mean economic inequality, the fact that people of color tend to have lower incomes, earlier death rates, or all kinds of ways in which they're sort of harmed in our current economy. And there are many Americans who say it is the system, right? It's a problem of discrimination and of the legacy of slavery, et cetera, and Jim Crow racism. There are other people who say, no, it's that people of color aren't working hard enough. If they worked hard enough, like I do, they could get what I have, right? And so there's a real divide there. But there's research that shows that you can actually influence those attitudes if you expose people to information about the advantages, for example, that whiteness has in our society. you can actually have people see more the other side of the coin, right? That there are people for whom they simply didn't have equal opportunity, right? So for me, that's the hopeful part of the book, this idea that we might be able to use it to actually influence attitudes and perhaps to bridge some of the gaps, which is dearly needed. I mean, we're so polarized right now in this country. I think less on issues and more on the fact that there's such hostility between the right and the left. So I really think the theory could help with that. I think it could get us to have real conversations about facts rather than responding always on an emotional level. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, oh, absolutely, it does.
Yeah,
I,
good.
I read a book by the psychologist Drew Weston. He has a book.
Yes, I know that
Yes,
book.
he has a
Yes.
book called The Political Brain.
Yes, I used to use it in my class.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice.
Yeah.
So I like that argument that when reason and emotions collide,
Yes.
emotions invariably win. And this is
Yes.
what we see always in politics most of the time. So it all goes back to how much can the electorate get in terms of information,
Yes.
exposure to information that is credible, information that is legitimate, that can in turn influence the political attitude they develop towards a candidate, towards a political party, or towards the options that they have in an election. So one last question I have for you is that of the target audience for this book. Who do you think is going to greatly benefit if they are to get their hands on this book?
Well, unlike a lot of academic books, I actually wrote it for a popular audience. So I've been told it's very approachable, that people who are even non-psychologists or non-political scientists can understand it. I really aim to make it really readable so that any regular person who is interested in psychology or interested in politics would be able to pick it up. And so that is one audience that I really was sort of aiming for, was, a more educated audience that is just interested in these issues. However, I think it has a lot of other possibilities. I am currently using it in a political psychology course, which is an undergraduate advanced seminar. I've known of people who've used it in graduate courses, particularly in political psychology, but even political sociology, or I think there's a range of different areas where it could be used academically. So that would be another potential audience. And lastly, my hope was that it could even be useful for practitioners. So I talk about in the book that one of my frustrations is that very few politicians use the kind of techniques that are outlined in this book. So you don't hear politicians talking very much about the causes of social problems in any kind of deep way. It's more superficial. I blame this or I blame that. But I agree with you. I think we could use more reason in politics. And so my hope would be that politicians might consider, actually, when they're preparing their campaigns, really thinking about, how can I present this in a way that will draw people in? Because I do think people are receptive to the ideas of really looking at causation. So I think politicians themselves, people who work on campaigns, I feel like all of those kinds of, even people working on social policy, for example, if you're trying to, get people to contribute money to help with heart disease even, right? You would want to make sure that people understood heart disease is not all caused by individual failings. Heart disease can be caused by things outside of our control. So I'm often surprised when you see these campaigns that are trying to raise money that they don't tend to focus on those kinds of issues, and they really do impact people. There's a lot of evidence that we're much more willing to give money if we think a person is not at fault than we are if we think they got themselves into the situation. So those are sort of the audiences that I am particularly interested in reading the book, and I hope will.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Professor Gail Sahar. Viewers and listeners, those of you who would like to get a copy of this book, please do not forget to click the link that is in the description panel of this video. Professor Gail Sahar, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
That's wonderful.